My name is David Madigan. I'm the chair of the statistics department here at Columbia, and I'm very pleased to moderate this session. I was going to give you all a little statistics lesson, but I think I'll desist and just go straight to the panelists. I was going to give you a cautionary tale about how very difficult it is to do sensible analysis of non-design data. Right? So data that come from design experiments are one thing, but the kind of data that I think we're mostly talking about here are fraught with difficulties and risks in terms of analyzing them and interpreting the analysis. But enough of that. So the first speaker in the panel is Jake Carlson. He's Associate Professor of Library Science and a Data Services Specialist with the Purdue University Libraries.
Thank you, David. And I really want to thank everyone for inviting me to this fabulous event. I'm very pleased to be a part of this. As David mentioned, I am a librarian at Purdue University. And I want to take a moment before getting into the meat of my presentation to sort of talk a bit about data librarianship at Purdue. I want to then talk a bit about lifecycle models. And I think there's different types of lifecycle models that really are relevant to the conversations that we're having here. And I want to take a brief minute to introduce some different types of lifecycle models that I've observed. And then I want to get into the topic of the panel in terms of focusing on the assure, describe, and preserve aspects that we've been tasked with talking about. So with no further delay, Purdue, we have a program really that's designed to look at how can librarians have an impact in this new world of data? How can we take the knowledge and skills and expertise that we have, that we've used for centuries with books and with journals, and apply this to this emerging, evolving world of data? So do the skills that librarians have in terms of organizing and managing and disseminating and preserving materials, to what extent do they apply to this new world of data, and how can we engage in researchers to help them as they explore this particular area through increasing demands and increasing pressures to do more with their data? And so in order to do this, if we're to be successful, we really have to have an understanding of the current situations of researchers. We have to be able to talk with them and to figure out where they are and what we can do to interact with them. How can we connect them with the information, resources, and tools that they need to do the work that they're now expected to do with their data? And one of the things that we've done at Purdue is to devise something called the Data Curation Profile Toolkit. This is an interview protocol where librarians will go and talk to researchers about the work that they do. And there's sort of three overarching themes that come out of a completed profile. We get information about an individual data set, including information about its life cycle from the point of view of the researcher. And that's a really important point that we'll emphasize a bit later on in my presentation. We get an understanding of the current management practices for the data that are being done by the researcher. How are they managing and administering and working with the data? And we get a sense of the unmet needs that the researcher have. We have a sense of what would the researcher like to do with the data or is required to do with the data that they're not able to or don't feel confident in at the moment. So capturing those unmet needs is all part of a data curation profile as well. Both the interview protocol and completed data curation profiles are available from our website, which is datacurationprofiles.org. So from the data curation profile, as I mentioned, we generate an individual life cycle as purported by the researcher. And so this is an example of one of those from a particular profile that I've developed. And you can see there's a fair amount of complexity here. I know that you probably can't read the actual text here, but it's comprised of a number of different components. It's comprised of the data stage, again, as articulated by the researcher. So how does the researcher interpret the stages that his or her data moves through? There's information about outputs. What is the result of each stage? Some information about file size and the number of files, information about the formats and the different formats as they switch through the data lifecycle, and then some notes about the particular stage in general to give a description of the stage and what happens and how the researcher interprets that. And I refer to this as the individual data lifecycle model. This is really hyper-localized to a particular data set and to a particular research lab. The goal here really is to capture that information from the researcher and to use it to inform our services and interactions with that researcher. But there's also something called what I've referred to as organizational lifecycle models. So a number of libraries and other institutions are now offering their data services. They're kind of aggregating up from the individual data lifecycles they see to come up with a lifecycle that's meant to cover a large number of researchers or a large number of disciplines. This is an example from the University of Virginia Libraries Scientific Data Consulting Group. They came up with this, and they've used this as a means to develop their services and to communicate those services with people who may be interested in using them. And finally, there's something that I refer to as the community lifecycle model. So communities of practice that are out there, such as Data One, such as the lifecycle model that we're using as the basis for our conversations today, these are put out by communities to share best practices, to offer guidance to researchers and others who are involved in working with data as to what could or should be done with the data. So at a sort of a very high level, what are the goals and aspirations that we have with regards to the data and representing that in a lifecycle model fashion. And I think it behooves us at this point to sort of stop and ask ourselves, what is the benefit of a lifecycle model? Why are we clustering ourselves around the use of lifecycle models? How do they help us? Well, I think there's a couple of different things that I can come up with, and your mileage may vary here, about why lifecycle models can be of use. It helps define and explain some pretty complex processes in a way that makes it easier to understand and communicate. So a graphical representation of some pretty complex stuff. It helps to identify some important components, roles, milestones, other events that are needed to do the kind of work that we do, to really understand and get at the nature of the data and to make sense of it and apply services towards it. It demonstrates connections and relationships between component parts and the whole, with the knowledge that what happens earlier in the life cycle has a pretty important effect on the later stages, especially as we get towards the curation and the preservation stages of things. And it provides a framework for us to develop services and support, and not only develop them and sort of conceptualize what kind of things we might offer, but communicate them both to ourselves internally so that people involved in providing these services have a shared understanding of what it is we're trying to do, as well as to the audiences that we're trying to communicate with in terms of offering services. But I also think it's important for us to understand some of the limitations of lifecycle models in doing this as well. So I have the quote here, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I do think lifecycle models are very useful, but I don't think we should be blind to their potential limitations. And I think some of those limitations are that they reflect the interests, perspectives, and biases of their agencies. If we're putting forth models of best practice, we're doing that from a perspective of what we think best practice is. And that's important to acknowledge. They mask complexity. So once you get towards aggregating information taken from individual lifecycle models, you lose some of the complexity. You lose some of the distinction and detail of those individual lifecycle models that researchers are going through. They overlook heterogeneity and diversity. If we're putting forth a service model that's meant to cover multiple disciplines or multiple areas of study, you lose the distinction and differences between those areas of study. And they often present research as orderly or linear. First this happens, then something else happens. But I think as we all know, research is a messy and complex process. There may be times you get to the analysis stage of your research life cycle, but realize that you have an error in your data, or for some reason you have to go back and start collecting data all over again. So it's not necessarily a neat and orderly linear process. And finally, models depict the ideal. Again, going back to the notion that we as service providers in this area, we want to see research done in this way. But research practice, as it goes on the ground, may not in fact live up to that ideal that we're putting out there in our life cycle models. And so, with that in mind, I'm going to take a stab at trying to look at individual life cycles through a community life cycle perspective. And this comes from the folks that I've talked to in the interviews that I've done as a research data specialist. So this is sort of an amalgamation of my collected impressions of how research is actually being done from the folks that I've talked with. First, we start out with a plan. And plan may mean many different things to different people. Oftentimes, it's planning the research. It's not necessarily planning out the data. The data management plan requirement is helping with that, but I think as Gail pointed out, there's a whole range of possibilities with data management plans. Some folks really don't know how to respond to this or see it as just another document to fill out, but other folks have really taken to it and have really sort of seen the purpose and the utility of it and have invested themselves in that. But there's wide variation there in that particular stage. Moving on to data collection, data is acquired or collected in some fashion. There's usually, from the folks that I've talked to, some sort of stage where data is processed. It's filtered or manipulated in some way to then prepare it for analysis. This is where the research question, the data is analyzed to try to answer that research question and to generate value for that particular researcher. But all of this is done with sort of the Uber stage in mind, with publishing the paper. That is driving the data lifecycle from the researchers that I've talked to. And oftentimes, they will include publication as a stage in their lifecycle when I ask them to describe the lifecycle of their data set. Some of them will say, well, I do publish my data. In fact, I publish them in figures and tables in the article itself. And that constitutes data publishing in my mind. And so I think we need to be aware that this is sort of a very narrow path that folks are going down in the current environment that they work in. So with reliance on, or with discussion about Assure is done. I don't see this, or it's not described to me by researchers as a separate and distinct stage. It's not really an event, it's more of a process. And assurance goes through those initial 4 stages of the data lifecycle. But assurance is done in a very narrow context. It's assuring that the data can move through this point to get to the published paper. That is the end goal in assuring one's data in this particular process. And so things are done in terms of quality control and communicating it, but it's done in the local lab environment. And usually, it's not just the fact that they're done in the stage, but assurance is better represented maybe by the arrows between those stages, that the spaces in between those stages where data is handed off or transformed into different formats, that's where assurance really becomes critical for the researchers in working with their data. And similarly, with describe. Describe is something that's also done by researchers, but it's done in a very narrow context. It's done to describe the data so that others in the group can understand and make use of it to generate the published paper. So description, oftentimes, while it does happen, it may not happen in a written format or in ways that can be captured very easily. It's often done during one-on-one discussions between a graduate student and his or her advisor, for example. And the advisor may have questions and want to get a better sense of what's going on, but that happens in a conversation, and capturing that conversation can be very difficult. Or it may happen in communications via emails that are sent across. It's not necessarily done in ways that are associated with the data set. And finally, the preserve aspect. Preservation is kind of a dotted line out of publishing paper, in that it's a nice idea and it's something that I think most researchers I've talked to really wish they had, but it's not necessarily to take action to actually doing it. Their preservation method is kind of a benign neglect method. And as we all know, that's really not an effective preservation method. But it's not that folks aren't interested in this. They definitely are, but they don't necessarily see the benefit for them in doing this if publishing in the paper is the end goal, as it seems to be for most folks. But they also don't know how to do it. They have an idea of what a preserved data set might look like, but getting from there to where they are without the knowledge and background and skills, they're not sure how to go about that. This is not their area of training. And so I'm going to take a moment to try and recast that data lifecycle model in a slightly different fashion to sort of talk about some of the issues that we've got here. I think, as came up in one of the earlier presentations, we have sort of a problem with getting data to the curation stage, to the point where we can share it and use it outside of the lab. We have sort of an hourglass situation in which active data management takes place at the top of that hourglass, and data curation takes place beneath it. And the choke point is right here in the middle, because we're only getting, what, 15% was the figure that was mentioned this morning? That's a very small amount from the actual work and the actual data that's being generated in these individual labs. And so what I think we need to do is look at our current situation as kind of in the top of the hourglass, publishing the paper as being the choke point, with the dotted line towards preserve, toward the kind of work that we want to do in making the data more available. This is sort of our current situation. We need to pay more attention to how folks assure and describe their data. How do they document that? How do they describe their data currently in their individual labs? And we need to be able to expand that choke point, not just to wait until the data are published, but to work with them as much as we can earlier on in the life cycle, and not just about the data, but about how they describe or how they document that data as well, and to open up avenues where they can share that information with us earlier on in the life cycle. Moreover, I think we need to have a two-way conversation. The folks that I've talked to are keenly aware that they're not doing the kind of job they want to do with regards to documenting or describing their data. They're looking for help. They really want to know how to do this in ways that not only benefit what we're trying to do in sharing and disseminating and preserving data, but can benefit them immediately further upstream in the process, where they can get utility out of it immediately, as well as contribute to the larger field. And so we need to have better ways and more frequent ways of communicating. We definitely need tools, we definitely need resources, but we need to find ways to communicate those in ways that take place during the research life cycle. And that's one of the things we're trying to do at Purdue with deputizing librarians to go out and have these conversations and interactions with faculty. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Stephen Morales. He's Project Director for the Digital Preservation Network. Prior to this work, he was Director of the Darden Solutions Business School Consortium at the University of Virginia, Darden Graduate School of Business.
All right, my name is Steve Morales. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm with the Digital Preservation Network. You'll also hear it referred to as DPN or DEEPN. It's an idea that's been percolating around for a couple of years within the university community and then really kicked into high gear back in the spring of last year. There was a presentation made at ARL and then again at the AAU President's Meeting where the concept of having a digital preservation network, an archive, a federated system of repositories to control the data that on the long-term basis could be controlled by the university community themselves and not dependent upon any one organization, any one technology. The whole goal is to create a heterogeneous environment for preservation that has no single point of failure. And it was after the AAU meeting when the call was made. I was not there at the time, and I picture there was a presentation at a podium and a fist went down and it says, "We have to do this." And 20 university presidents said, "Okay, we're in." And then 30, and then 35, and 40. And the presenters turned around and said, "Okay, we got to do it now." That's when I came on board in July. So I wasn't part of the earlier conversations, but I kicked in and started in July after we really were already up to 40 members, had put in the initial $20,000 to fund the development of DEEPN, and that's how I'll refer to it. That number is close. It's over 50 universities at this point. You can go to the website. It's dpn.org. That'll give you some more background information. Most of the universities, I think, that are represented here are charter members within DEEPN, and I thank you very much for your participation to get this started. Jim Neal is from Columbia, is actually the head of our succession rights working group and has been a key leader thus far. My first goal when I got started with DEEPN in July was to bring together the technology leads from the 5 proposed repositories which would make up this federated network of repositories, which is DEEPN. I've just finished having phone calls with all of our 50-plus members, giving them this pretty much the same presentation over the course of 45 minutes. So in the course of the next 7, I'm going to give you an update on what's been happening. So we have 5 repositories that are currently proposed to be the initial replicating nodes for DEEPN. That is the Stanford Digital Repository, Chronopolis, working with the San Diego Supercomputer. You've got TAC, the Texas Advanced Computing Center, working with the Texas Digital Library, HathiTrust, as well as an up-and-coming organization called AP Trust. Those are the 5 repositories who are at the table right now working to build out. It certainly won't be the end of the repositories that we add for the replicating side, but those are the ones that are at the table right now. We also have DuraSpace, Andrew Woods from DuraSpace. Although they're not a repository, their technologies are so intertwined with the rest of our membership that I thought it prudent to have them part of the discussion. So the technology working group has been meeting together weekly since July in a conference call every Wednesday afternoon, which I'm going to miss today. But they've met face-to-face in Stanford and Chicago and Washington, D.C. And their main task was to design the initial architecture for DEEPN. What is it going to look like? How is content that is deposited into one node going to then be replicated out to the other nodes? What's that framework look like? And they started off an exercise where each repository created a straw man architecture, if they were in charge, what it would look like. And then over the course of successive weeks, they worked through each of those proposals and came up with a final design for DEEPN, which they think is something we should go forward with. They've been testing that design the last couple of months. They've been moving data around, moving bits around, leading up to really this week. Well, there was a meeting in February, the very beginning of February, between the DEEPN technology team down in Florida and the DEEPN leadership group, just to make sure that we were still in alignment. Now that they had created this framework, are the services that they proposed and the architecture that they've designed actually what we thought it was going to be? And that meeting went off spectacularly well. There was close alignment between the initial vision for DEEPN and what the technology working group has put together. And so tomorrow, actually, the first DEEPN newsletter is going to go out to the membership, the 50-plus universities and their technology teams, and it's time to really get into a period of feedback and discussion. Is this the right architecture? How does your content go from your repository into DEEPN? What has been missed? What needs to be added? What needs to be tweaked? And by summertime, I expect that feedback process to be sufficient to the point where we can actually start doing use cases, start taking in data, to start showing how the process would work, which we'll do for the rest of 2013. And then DEEPN will be open for accepting deposits from charter members beginning in 2014. So again, to recap, tomorrow or the next day is when the first newsletter will go out. It'll provide not only an update on the progress of the technology working group, but you will also be able to have access to the technical working documents on a wiki that is hosted by DuraSpace, because I know many of you would like to go deep into I'm not going to be able to cover that today, but go deep into what's being proposed. And I'm going to err on the side of making a lot more documentation available about DEEPN than less. So whatever you need to have, ask for it. I will make sure it gets provided. That's the progress of the technology working group. The other distinctive for DEEPN is that we are actually going to be having succession rights agreements in place for each of the deposits which are made. We don't want to have a lot of content that's in a dark archive that 20 years from now we have no rights to do anything with. If the time comes when the depositor is no longer interested in the data or is no longer in existence, we need to have the rights in place that we can bring that data back out to the university, back out to researchers, back out to the general public. And so succession rights will be key to making that happen. And as I mentioned before, Jim Neal from Columbia is leading a succession rights working group to work through these issues. They've been reaching out to other organizations, and I've asked them to provide two templates by the end of spring, which we could then incorporate into agreements with our depositors for DEEPN. And I would love to work off of the success of other organizations. So if any of you all are part of a group that has dealt with succession rights, please get in touch with us, because we've been reaching out to organizations and have found that there's very little work been done in this space, with the exception of ICPSR, which with DataPass has really, we're going to looking at their documentation, because they have actually made great progress in this area. That working group, in addition to Jim, is comprised of Sandra Enamil from OSU, Donna Ferrulo from Purdue, Peter Hurdle at Cornell, Kevin Smith at Duke, and Prue Adler from ARL. Those are the ones that are working through those issues of succession rights, with the expectation that they'll have some documents for us to review at the end of the spring, early summer. The leadership team right now that is overseeing DEEPN has been talking through governance issues. Michael McRoby, the president of Indiana, is reaching out to other university presidents to see who would be willing to sit on a board of directors for DEEPN. It's going to very much resemble the progress that was made with Internet 2. And there are a couple of different paths that we could go as far as governance in the future. Right now, we are technically a project within Internet 2. They provide all of our financial services. All of the money that's been paid into DEEPN is actually going to Internet 2. They're providing audit, fiduciary services. We could potentially stay within the auspices of an organization such as Internet 2, or we could stand alone on our own 2 feet as a nonprofit organization with a board of directors comprised of university presidents, CIOs, and university librarians. And so the proposals of governance will be going out to the membership later this summer, later in the fall, once we have some presidents lined up who would potentially serve as on the board of directors. Currently, the leadership group consists of Paul Courant, Hadi Trust, Brian Schottlander from San Diego, Karin Wittenberg from UVA, Michael Keller from Stanford, Paula Kaufman with Illinois, Winston Tabb, Johns Hopkins, Ann Wolpert, MIT, Jim Neal, Columbia, Abby Rumsey, James Hilton from UVA, John Wilkin, Michigan, Brad Englert, UT Austin, and John Evans, the founder of C-SPAN. Those are the ones that are currently the ones I report to. So while our fiduciary responsibilities are held by Internet 2, there's actually nobody at Internet 2 that I report to. I'm reporting back to this leadership team. The final working group that is yet to be convened, but will be convened next week, is the business model working group. It's the one that I'm most keenly interested in seeing what is the sustainability model for long-term preservation. And it's going to take two There's really two sides to that coin. One is, what is the cost for preserving data for 100 years out? I mean, as far as working with vendors to determine how often are you going to have to change your mediums, what is the expense going to be today to pay for long-term preservation? And maybe it's 20 years or 50 years. We're going to have to look at what the long-term costs are. I know there's been some terrific research done in this area, especially I think California Digital Library has done some excellent research on the long-term costs. I think Saeed over at Johns Hopkins has. And so I'm going to be convening a team of individuals focused on the cost side of long-term preservation, and then also what are the different sources of revenue for DEEPN. It'll certainly have a membership model. It'll have some sort of deposit fees associated with content that's going into DEEPN, and we want to make sure that we are not the first backup copy. All right, we are not your Barracuda network for your data, but we're your catastrophic loss recovery. It's the content going into DEEPN is going to be there. It's going to be preserved using different technologies by different organizations, so we know that we'll have a copy of it, but we don't want you accessing it all the time. And so there'll need to be some sort of governor in there to come with withdrawal fees and deposit fees. The working group related to the business model will work through these issues, bring it back to the membership, make sure that's something that's going to be workable, and then we'll move forward. The whole goal of DEEPN is together at scale, we have to be able to do this more efficiently than we would all do it individually. And while we are focused on preservation and the dark archive, I see DEEPN becoming as involved as we can in helping facilitate the conversation at the very beginning of the stack. So with some of our momentum and some of our funding, we can help facilitate conversations between researchers and the librarian services, the local preservation services that are going to take place. We would love to do that. I've talked to a number of funding agencies. I've been back and forth to DC almost every week, it seems like. But meeting with the archives and the Smithsonian, IMLS, and NSF. I'll be going to NSF this afternoon for a couple days working with them. But the funding agencies are certainly interested in going to the next step. And I don't know what it looks like as it relates to creating the whole business model around data. And I have a vision for creating a new economy around data, a new marketplace, if you will, where data that is created actually has some funding that's always associated with it. And that funding will be used by those organizations providing access services, curation services, and there'll hopefully be a little bit left over for DEEPN at the very end on the preservation side. And I don't know what that looks like, but I'm a bit of an outsider to this community, and it's just clearly something that needs to be there so that the access tier can be fully funded. And those that are providing access services and local preservation services can have a predictable funding stream to pay for their services. And in talking to the funding agencies in Washington, they're very excited that the universities have come together to fund infrastructure. And that's our first stage. We're going to build out long-term preservation infrastructure very similar to how Internet 2 built out long-term data pipes, and then now they're providing Net Plus services. DEEPN is going to build that preservation infrastructure and backbone, and then we'll be providing additional services at some point in the future. In conclusion, I'd like to say that while we were really started by ARL institutions and AAU institutions, by no means is DEEPN a closed community. There's going to be a place for whoever needs long-term preservation as part of their strategy and can plug in with DEEPN. I am more than welcome to bring you into the membership of DEEPN. Things have been really busy, so if I haven't reached out to you yet, it's not because of neglect or disinterest. You are certainly welcome to become part of DEEPN. There's forms on the website that you can fill out either for membership or just to receive updates, newsletters, and other content as we go forward. So there's 2 different forms you can fill out on dpn.org, and I would be happy to be available to you individually as well to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. The third speaker is Linda Beebe, who's recently retired from her position as Senior Director of PsycINFO at the American Psychological Association. She was co-chair of a working group with the longest working group name I've ever seen, but it ends with Supplemental Journal Article Materials Project Business Working Group. That's the last half of it.
Thank you. We didn't give ourselves that name, I will tell you. I, too, want to thank the organizers and the sponsors for inviting me to this terrific symposium. I'm very happy to be here today talking about this NISO-NFAIS project. A great many people worked on this for what felt like a very long time. So we're glad to have it come to fruition. Around 2000, when this swell of supplemental materials began, I don't think any of us really anticipated the burden it would become. It was a brave new world then. Technology allowed us to add almost anything to supplement an article, and we did. All of a sudden, page limits were not a concern for authors or editors. We could add all kinds of text and tables and figures. Authors weren't paying for color figures when they went up on the web. And then there was all that multimedia and all the gene sequences, structures, 3D images, executables, and so forth. And there was some data. And what we had, very shortly, was pretty much a mess. There were no standards, and we all know how different the cultures and practices are from one discipline to another. We ended up with inconsistent identifiers or non-existent identifiers, extraordinarily poor metadata, lack of discovery tools. It was a really haphazard whether you would even realize that there was supplemental data accompanying an article. And so we had what Sasha Schwartzman calls abuse. Abuse of the peer reviewers who were expected to wade through all of this stuff and abuse of readers who really had no clear idea what it was. A couple indicators of the problem. In August 2010, the Journal of Neuroscience announced that it would no longer accept supplemental material because of the burden on their peer reviewers. The Journal of Clinical Investigation has very carefully charted the growth in supplemental materials, going from 2% of articles when they began in 2000 to 95% in 2011. And there were other issues. Other journals have followed suit. Cell had limited things in 2009. Sasha Schwartzman, who was then at IGU, had done a survey in late 2009 and circulated a white paper. And we put together, NISO-NFAIS, a group of us, a meeting on whether this was really a problem at American Psychological Association in January 2010. And we formed this working group, and you will see that there was a wide breadth of disciplines involved, which was key in trying to put together these recommendations. We actually had two coordinated working groups. There was a business working group that Marie McVeigh from Thomson Reuters co-chaired with me, and a technical working group that Dave Martinson, who's sitting right over here, from ACS, and Sasha Schwartzman, who's now at the Optical Society, co-chaired. We formulated as a full group practices that would help the scholarly community develop more standardized approaches. We really wanted to lessen the burden on everyone. We wanted to increase the potential for utility and substance in the materials. Many of the things we were finding on the supplemental materials are really not relevant or useful. My suspicion has always been the editor said you have to cut that out of the journal article, and they threw it in the supplemental materials. And we wanted to enhance the discoverability. And then the big thing was nobody had given too much thought to how these things would be preserved. There are all kinds of complications. You really don't have a full appreciation for how siloed our disciplines are until you start trying to look at citation practices, even things like placement of links. It's all over the place. There's a real difference in readers' need for information. You have people who read for current awareness. You have experts who want just snatches. And then you want people who really want to understand how you went about doing this. And then we're all clinging still to print, and yet the technology was changing so rapidly. When we first began talking in the summer of 2010, when the groups got underway, journals were almost all text. By the time we completed this in 2012, many journals were able to incorporate some things within the journal article. Data was a key discussion item at first, because for some people, supplemental materials, that's what they meant. They thought they meant data. But that's really not the case. We heard from both of our keynote speakers this morning, and our experience is most of the supplemental data, as David said, is audiovisual or, in the case of social sciences, mountains of text. And it's certainly supplemental materials are not suited the way we've structured them for preservation. I really like this illustration that F.K. Schmidt and her colleagues came up with. You'll find it on the STM website, where she's layered what we're talking about with data. And the publication data is just that little tiny bit at the top of the pyramid. And what we ended up saying we would consider in the supplemental materials is that next piece. Other people are dealing with all the other issues of standards for collection, submission, fixity, and so forth. We developed a series of 12 guiding principles. Some of them were just how we were going to work, but two that might be key to today is that everything we came up with had to be business model neutral and the issue around the data. So after 2.5 years of work, we do have an official NISO recommended practice, and I'll give you the URL. And it is co-sponsored by the National Information Standards Organization and the National Federation of Advanced Information Systems. The approximately 35-page document is divided into Part A for business practices, and you'll see them there. I don't have time to go through them, but there really are selection editing, metadata, a lot on discoverability. And then the technical working group in Part B have done things like provide a series of minimal metadata, and I believe there was something like 18 optional elements of metadata. They've done a non-normative DTD. They've done a tag library. It's a very good piece of work. When we began to discuss supplemental material, we ended up dividing it into integral and supplemental, additional. And you can imagine the 10 or 12 people on the phone call when we started calling supplemental material integral. What an oxymoron. But these are the things that publishers are putting into supplemental material. They're putting them outside the article because they lack the technical ways of doing it. And we probably really believe this is a transitory phase. I think that authors got ahead of publishers in capacity, actually. And then additional is what you really would think about supplemental. It's relevant, it's useful, but you don't need it to understand the core article. And what we really envisioned is what Emily Marcus, the editor of Cell, described as a layered approach. And getting away from a linear journal article that's been the same for 300 years practically, not quite, but last 60 or 70 anyway, it would be chunked and identified easily so that the user can find what they need very quickly. When you go through this, there are 4 common themes: persistency, linking is a big deal, and bidirectional links. And when we began, many repositories could not do bidirectional linking. Consistency, publishers have been all over the waterfront from article to article, from issue to issue, from journal to journal, and we're preaching consistency. Discoverability, not very many A&I services even tell you that there are supplemental materials, let alone tell you what those supplemental materials might be or link to them. And publishers have to make it easy for A&Is to pick that up. And then preservation, all the markup tagging. Distributed repositories, because publishers can't always do this, maybe shouldn't be doing it. Maybe if there is an official repository, then that's where it belongs. For some disciplines, there's not, and we got to figure that one out. Here are some related sites. The full document. Sasha had given a very thorough presentation at 2012 Council of Science Editors. I presented at the ICSTE conference last fall, and there were some other very interesting presentations there. And then the article in the NISO newsletter described what we were about. This document really is written specifically for publishers, encouraging publishers to give very clear guidelines to their authors, their peer reviewers, their editors. But we hope that it's pertinent to all the parties in the research cycle. And we do hope these will become more useful, more persistent, and not so difficult to handle. American Psychological Association, as soon as we came to the end, we took a really good hard look at what we were doing then and what we needed to do to be fully compliant, and our publications board voted it all in last November. And Dave was telling me that he read the other day that there's another journal who has said, we use these guidelines. So I have lots of hope. Thank you.
The respondent is Robert Downs, who's Senior Digital Archivist and Acting Head of Informatics and Cyber Infrastructure R&D at the Center for International Earth Science Information Network here at Columbia.
Thank you, David. And, no, I don't have slides. And thank you to all the speakers as well as to the organizers. I think this is a great session, bringing together Jake Carlson, Linda Beebe, and Stephen Morales. Jake talked about the different life cycle models, their strengths, their limitations, and gave us an introduction to the data curation profile toolkit that they use to identify the needs of researchers for each stage of the life cycle. I thought that it was insightful that he also talked about how the life cycle models demonstrate connections and the relationships and the opportunities for services as well that might be offered to the research community to facilitate the stewardship of their data. Also, it was interesting that he pointed out that many of the researchers see the life cycle going to the end point of publishing the paper. From a data perspective, we see that it's a little bit short-sighted, and often with the data, that's the beginning when you publish the paper, or near the beginning, I should say. I think that was an interesting observation as well, and that he sees the assurance as a process and the descriptions and the preservation really fitting in with that, and how the benefits of preservation are not always obvious to those who are involved, especially those who are the researchers. I think that reminds me a little bit of our discussions earlier this morning, where we were talking about how the benefits really need to be apparent to the researchers who are out there. And finally, Jake mentioned that we need to work earlier with researchers during the life cycle. I thought that was really a great observation. Steve Morales talked about the DPIN, how they're organizing a federated system of repositories, and how they've got over 50 universities already involved, and they've identified 5 replicating nodes, and the challenges as well, such as the challenges for succession rights, the challenge for sustainability models will facilitate long-term preservation, and how they really need to focus on the costs as well as the potential revenues in order to move forward in this. And I think some of the things that I saw very valuable in this is that one of their goals is to improve efficiency of data stewardship, and as well to improve the funding opportunities so that they can enable long-term data access. And then finally, Linda Beebe, she talked to us about easing the burden of the supplemental materials. And she observed how the new technologies have given us great affordances, all these new capabilities, but at the same time they've brought new challenges with them. And they've resulted in, as she mentioned, the lack of standards, some abuses, extensive growth, as well as preservation, which is just hanging out there as a problem that needs to be addressed. She also offered some guiding principles and recommended practices, both giving us a business perspective as well as the technical considerations. And I thought it was great that she ended her talk saying that she hopes this would be pertinent to all parties in the research life cycle, which brings me to another observation, and that I think when we hear about these different systems, the networks, the tools that are all being developed, we have to remember that we've seen this before in the development of MIS systems, for example, in the development of data systems as well, where all these different groups are all developing their own little silos, if you will, and these are great that they're doing this, but I think we also need to think about ways to integrate them so that in the end, the researchers will have choices, and the other parties in the process as well will have choices, and not just choices that they have to make at the beginning, which repository am I going with, which network, which tools, but give them choices so that they will have flexibility throughout the entire data life cycle. So if they change their minds later, they can say, no, I'm no longer going with this network, system, or repository, or tools. I'm going with this other group now, and perhaps later I'll change my mind again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would any of the panelists like to make a response or a comment at this point before we open it up? No? Okay, so the floor is open for questions, comments. I'd like to take the, seeing as I'm here and I have the microphone, I thought the life cycle models were fascinating. I mean, I'm sitting there thinking about that from the perspective of a researcher. And like you said, research is very messy, and I was trying very hard to fit what I do into that, and partly succeeding, but not totally. But in one way in particular, which is where you have the analyze, one of those models you showed, and the analysis itself generates data. Yes. And actually, it's one of the key problems. I presume I wasn't here this morning. I presume Victoria Stodden talked about this morning. But I mean, the key barrier to reproducibility is the lack of the data that go with the analysis. So in the field I work in, which is mostly with healthcare data, there's essentially never enough data to reproduce what somebody did. And it's a key problem is how do you preserve that? And in particular, if you pick up an article that's 5 years old or whatever, there's no way to get back to the data that existed at some point to describe what that person did. So it seems to me a key problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a cycle.
Leon Rezniker, IT. Jake was talking about different methods how to control and assure data quality. And we were talking about a number of different indicators. On the other hand, we do have a lot of data already available, and probably someone will come up with another law to share with us how long it takes to double amount of data. If it's every year, half a year, another move probably. But the problem is that that data which is available is very rarely accompanied by any data quality indicator.
I'm sorry, I don't know if your mic is on. I'm really having trouble hearing your question.
Point it to your mouth. Just point.
Okay.
That's better.
Okay. So what I'm talking about is that there are a lot of data quality indicators available. On the other hand, data which is available is not accompanied by any data quality indicator. And that's a problem because probably there are too many indicators. Do you think that we have to start thinking about creating some kind of an integral indicator, data quality, which will match together? And because actually, from the point of view of a user wants to know how much trust I can have in this particular data. So
Yeah.
how to answer this question?
Okay. I think what I was trying to convey wasn't so much the tools or the means by which researchers use to assure their data, but the fact that that process, that task is more locally focused and internally focused rather than externally focused. And one of the things that I think we need to do with regards to talking with our researchers is to communicate a larger perspective to them, to open up that their data are in fact going to be used, if they are shared, if they're mandated or choose to put in the depository, they are going to be used by other people, and to take that into consideration when they choose their methods of assurance. So if there are particular standards that are out there for assuring or for documenting data that are recognized as being trustworthy, that we need to connect them with those standards and that community to enable that sort of trust to take place. So in the conversations that I've had with data, with researchers using the data curation profile, it's almost sort of a stealth education process, and that I'll ask a question. Data discovery in particular sort of comes up as one that I've never really thought about how others would try to discover my data. It's not clear to me, what I would need to do to make that happen. And I think that's also the case with assurance. It's not clear to them what trust in their data would mean outside of that local context.
Mike Rossner from Rockefeller University Press. A question for Stephen, but whether your network has gotten to the stage of deciding what types of data you plan to preserve.
It's a great question. Right now, the conversations within the replicating nodes is that they would like to be agnostic to what type of data that's going into it. So they're going to wrap it up into a container that's going to be put into the other replicating nodes. And so we're looking at text, we're looking at research, traditional archive data for libraries that they normally would be in their archives. We're looking at multimedia. It's not going to be specific to any one kind of data, although certain disciplines are further advanced. In other words, their data is really ready to go into long-term preservation, and in other disciplines, the data probably isn't ready yet. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, it takes some thought to figure out exactly what you're going to be able to host. You just can't be completely agnostic. So, there are types of medical images that,
right,
may be a file type that you can store on a disk, but that file type in that format is useless to anybody. So I think it takes a bit more thought than just saying you're agnostic.
Well, we're going to start with the low-hanging fruit first of all. I mean, for example, only one of the 5 replicating nodes right now can handle medical research data. I think Chronopolis is the only one that's approved for medical data at this point. So we obviously can't be taking in medical data until there's HIPAA compliancy across at least 3 nodes. And so these things will come out in the conversations that are going to start up really this week, back and forth to find out what are the right communities. And Winston Tabb from Johns Hopkins is charged with engaging a working group to talk to the data communities to find out which ones will be the first ones coming in to deepen. But we're not going to start with all the data right now, but our goal would be that as we build out the infrastructure, we would not be excluding any one particular kind of data for reasons besides technology initially.
Presumably there are issues of scale as well. I mean, I'm thinking I work with some astronomers who generate hundreds of terabytes a night. I mean, would put some stress on the system, I presume.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Quickly.
Hi, I'm Todd Hines at Princeton University. I'm hidden behind the columns, I think, for most of you.
That's why.
Well, my question's actually very, very similar to the last one, but just also for Stephen. Yeah, because I think with the metadata, with the data description, a couple of things with people's experience. One of my colleagues describes it with a lot of tech people. They equate storage with access instead of the metadata, having the metadata and the description for access. And also that, yeah, the disciplines are very, very different in how you describe the data. Social science, what they probably need from the description and the metadata, very different from science data. So, yeah, it just seems like, I mean, you kind of talked a little bit about what your plans are, but yeah, if you had a lot of what, your committees and stuff to do that sort of thing, I think that's very, very important for us being able to access it and find it in the future.
Hi, I'm Simon Saki from University of Illinois. I have a kind of follow-up question myself. From what I heard, it seemed that you are basically doing kind of bit level preservation. So basically what is ingested in the system is given back to the user. But that, I mean, that kind of bit level preservation has been discussed in the last 15 years as not really solving the problems with digital preservation, you know, changes in technology and these kind of things. So what are your plans in terms of supporting, you know, access to the things that have been ingested when technology changed?
Haven't heard that one before.
I bet.
I'm just starting the circuit. You're actually right. Bit-level preservation is what is the first level of preservation services that are going to be provided as they build out the infrastructure. Moving up the stack and providing additional services once the infrastructure is in place is certainly going to, I know format migrations is going to be one of the first things that will be tackled within this community to see how do you best go about that. There's been discussions on how do you preserve the software that was used to create that content now that the software is no longer available. And so does DEEPIN need to be taking care of monitoring the versions and storing and archiving the versions of software being used. And so these issues, again, if we could easily be stuck in the mud if we try to tackle them all right now and come up with a blueprint for how it should work in all scenarios before we actually get started. And what we're going to do instead is actually get the federation in place, get the legal agreements in place, and then start moving up the stack with different services through collaboration with people who have already tackled it in different disciplines. I mean, some of these issues have been around for, like you said, decades. It's been handled very well in some disciplines. So taking some best practices from one discipline and helping facilitate that to another discipline, I think could be a good function of DEEPIN going forward.
Hi, I'm Yasmin Shoresh from James Madison University. A question actually for you, Stephen. You had mentioned that you have this vision of creating a new marketplace around data and relating to the funding of data as access. And we heard earlier from one of the keynotes talking about taking freely available data, analyzing it, repackaging it, and then selling that data back to corporations. And I want to get a little bit more into what you meant about creating this marketplace around data, because I think this funding issue is very important to many of us. And I want to know if you think the only option is taking other people's freely available data and repackaging it and then selling it back to other people is the only option.
Apples and oranges on the two different uses of the term there. What I'm actually, and actually I have a question back out to this community because I love the fact that there are so many researchers in the audience, and so I'm going to ask a question that I need the answer to as we work through the business model for DEEPIN. But what I'm referring to more is that when data is collected, when it's produced, that there's some amount of money that stays with that data for the purposes of access, preservation, and sharing going forward. That's the marketplace, because if data had some money attached to it, then people who are providing access services, people who are providing the ability to share and see that data would actually have some funding available to them to manage their operations. They would have a sustainable business model. And for me, looking in the long term, what would make DEEPIN successful is if we had a very robust access tier. Those disciplinary repositories, institutional repositories that are providing services for access, if that was robust, then we would have a strong source of data coming into the dark archive, to the preservation side. We're not going to be providing access services to the data that's in DEEPIN. So once it goes into DEEPIN, we're not going to be, except in a brightening event, at some point where we've been called upon to bring that data forth, we're not going to be the source of access for content. But my question out to the researchers is, what would motivate you to set aside some of your funding for your data to be accessed in the future for sharing and preservation once you're done with it? And if that answer is nothing is going to motivate me to set aside some of my funding for preservation and access, I'd like to hear that. If something would motivate you, I would love to hear that, because I think it's a conversation that needs to take place. So, anyway.
Could I just interject here? I think what I would like to see is some funding that comes in for the project that is associated with the long-term preservation, stewardship, and access to the data. And so if that money was earmarked from the beginning for that purpose, then we could be assured that it would be used for that purpose.
So my name is Gerhard Klimek. So we run this thing called NanoHub, where we have 240,000 users a year. I have a comment regarding your marketplace, right? You've got to make a marketplace. You got to make it working for providers and for users. The people that provide would like to sell, not pay, right? So you have to create a marketplace in which users are ultimately willing to pay for access. That is how we trade products on the market. The providers get something, not pay for something. So you have to develop some infrastructure where that is actually similar to an economy that works quite well.
Bob Chen, I was the original respondent. But anyway, I do have a question, partly I think something Jake said, talking about the data lifecycle from the viewpoint of the individual researcher. But I'm just curious if you have comments and thoughts about the community data lifecycle. I mean, we're talking, when we're talking at the level of DEEPIN, at a much higher level and a different ecology of users and funders who might be the ones who would have to answer your question, Stephen. So how do you see, you know, the individual model scaling up to the university or level, or to the discipline level, or to the, you know, the whole ecology of scientific data and data that comes in from outside science as well as, but is used by science? I mean, there's a lot of variations on the basic data lifecycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not that I'm trying to condemn a community lifecycle or raise the individual one as sort of the answer, because it's not. I mean, they serve very different functions, and while they're all related, they're distinct in their functions and their purposes, as it should be. I think what needs to happen is more events like this and more questions along the lines of what Steve just asked, of communicating with researchers to get a sense of what information would inform a community lifecycle and a community, based service along the lines of what he's describing. So a means to connect people and to involve them in the conversation in ways that make sense and align with their interests. So recognizing that individuals do have distinct lifecycle models or distinct practices they follow, but being able to acknowledge that and recognize that and fold that into a larger community purpose.
As a researcher, from wearing my researcher hat, that sort of resonates with me. That I think the mindset, forgive me if I'm incorrect, but your mindset is the researcher produces data and then has an interest in preserving that data.
Yes.
In a lot of certainly the areas of research that I'm familiar with, I don't produce the data. You know, there are central data gathered by other people, by the community, so to speak. That if it's not preserved, I have serious concerns about it, but I don't produce it.
But you still have a stake in its preservation.
Absolutely.
So you still need to be a part of the conversation.
Yes.
So yeah, I think, individual recognizing that data in fact are produced, and we rely on those producers as a means to fulfill and to contribute to all of this. You're still a stakeholder in that process, even though you're not necessarily a producer of all of that.
So there is a perfect business model, right? There's people that provide, and there's people that use, and there's a marketplace. You should be paying for some of the data in some shape or form. I, as a provider, for example, for non-electronic devices, should have some benefit from you getting usage out of that. The world is not free, right? I mean, it costs me a lot of money to generate that data. If you ask me to provide more money to him to host that data, that's kind of backwards.
But that cost should be passed on, presumably, to the people who are to the users. Simply, it should be built into the business
why
model.
should I pay first? No, seriously, there needs to be an opportunity place.
There's somebody back there.
I'm sorry, just to sort of continue the direction this discussion has taken, there's been no discussion in the business model of the sponsor's place. After all, the investigator is unlikely to fund any data preservation because the investigator has no funds. He's spending that of the sponsor as a rule. So has
the necessary agencies, foundations, et cetera, been approached as to whether this is something they would want in their budgets?
So at NIH, of course, NIH has a very diverse portfolio of research, and for some kinds of research, the answer is yes. I was the director of the National Database for Autism Research, for example, for a few years, and in that model, when you get a grant to do human subject autism research, you are asked to put money in to pay your people or yourself to then send the data to NDAR in the proper form and so forth. We recognize there's a cost to it. And we say, good, ask for the money in your grant. And we provided models for costing that and so forth. So the answer is sometimes yes.
But that means you directly funded the archive.
Right. We're also, well, we are, yes, we are also, correct. So that particular NDAR is a federally owned and operated repository. But my point is, in terms of the cost of submitting the data and all of that entails, the answer is yeah. That's an example of where NIH has been happy to support that with real money.
Thanks. If I can directly answer your question, when I talked this morning about having spoken to 7 funding bodies, that was very much part of that discussion. Every one of them said more or less yes. And Mike was one of the people I talked to as well. Let me give you one small example of where I know this is working well. There's a repository, the Archaeology Data Service in UK. Small, but it has usual funding problems. One of their funding bodies is the English Trust, who funds collection of data, if you will, or they fund research, or they also will fund digging. If somebody is doing, some kind of digging up some area and they need to do archaeological preservation on that site before the digging or the building continues or whatever. So they fund that research to collect the data. They require that every one of their funding recipients go first to the Archaeology Data Service, get a bid for how much data they're going to collect, how much it's going to cost to preserve it, and then that gets baked into the contract itself for the funding that they get. One of the models that does, at least in some areas, does work. And so, I heard soundly again and again, oh, that's an interesting model. Yes, we like that. And you're hearing, I think, more and more of the putting it into the funding grant of the X% that will take care of the data forever. I'm not sure that covers all the costs. That's what I was trying to say this morning, but that model is certainly in play.
I have one more example that is more an analogy. In any NSF proposal you write these days, about a quarter or a third of the space you ought to be using on education and outreach. You create a product that you normally would never create if it weren't a requirement, or you're a gifted person that just wants to do this kind of stuff. And it's only credible if you actually put real resources in that, right? So if we actually write our grants that say, I really need to, and we buy into that I need to deposit data here and I want to participate and I can get it funded, most agencies will probably pay for it. And it shows that the PI is actually serious about it. So I'm kind of tongue-in-cheek about why should I pay for it, but ultimately you need to create a marketplace that pays for it by itself. But before it gets there, it costs money from all kinds of sources. But it's the PIs that decide they want to do it. If you go there and twist arms and don't provide value from it, it's just twisting arms. It's not going to happen. Right?
But one missing piece is the reviewers have to actually look at that material. The panel and the staff have to take it seriously. And in some sense, there have to be community standards of what is reasonable for that. And I think that's one of the gaps that certainly inhibits the standard process.
But that goes up and down, right? There's some panels. There are panels that take that pretty serious. If you say, my outreach program is I'm going to travel to Nice in France and hold a little workshop, you're going to get killed, right? Or if you say, I'm going to run a big website and you don't put any money into it, you're going to get killed. I mean, the panels I've been on, they see it. They look at it. And I'm sure there's others that don't give a, right?
I do want to address the marketplace idea. Deepin itself is actually behind the marketplace that you're referring to, in the sense of the access tier with hundreds of thousands of users that are coming in and asking for data. That's not going to be Deepin's role, is providing access to content. We would be behind that access tier, and if you're providing, you would need to preserve your data. So how are you going to preserve your data? Okay, you're going to have a backup copy, but what is your preservation plan? And can Deepin be a part of that preservation plan for the long-term preservation of that content? And so we would charge you for your deposit into Deepin. That's our value that we're adding, is instead of you building out a large infrastructure with multiple copies and multiple environments, that's where we would come in. We have to provide value to that access tier in order for us to have a business model. But the one that you're speaking to, where people are actually coming and retrieving data, that absolutely needs to be developed, but that wouldn't fall into ours.
That is the true market value. If I just want to preserve my own data, I buy a hard drive or deposit. I don't need it.
Sure.
Yeah, so I want to make a couple of points. There are a lot of models competing in this area, and I don't think we know really yet where to go. Just to add another model that works very successfully, the National Institute for Justice, when it awards grants, withholds from the PI the last 10% of the grant until the data is archived. So, so we get, since we maintain their archive, we get very high compliance from them. But that raises another. I think there are a couple of issues here. One is that, but if we're asking the PIs to put this money for the archiving into their grants, first of all, they're doing that before they even started the project. And we get requests for estimates all the time, and it's very hard for us to know what's going to come out at the end. In particular, we find that one of the biggest things that drives up the costs is whether the PI will answer questions that we send them. Because we have data sets where we get the data and it takes us 2 years to get them to answer a few emails so we can release it. And we have no control over that. I mean, if you think about this in terms of preservation, the fundamental problem here is that we're trying to use a short-term funding mechanism for a long-term purpose. And assuring that you have long-term preservation, is very difficult. I don't think it's impossible. I think but what we might need is for the funding agencies to actually be willing to put that money in a way that it is for the future, or perhaps for the past, in a certain sense. The second big issue that hasn't really been brought up very much, but is very related to costs, is the question of what are we actually going to preserve? Because the policies that most, NSF and NIH have tended to put out are that we should preserve everything. And as a starting point, I think that that's not so bad, because I'm trying to get people to think about preserving things and sharing things. But in the long run, not everything has to be preserved, and not everything has to be preserved forever. We did a survey on the Michigan campus, and there are differences between disciplines. There are certain disciplines that think in 5 years our instrumentation will be so much better that anything that's collected today is not going to be worth it. If we tried to preserve and curate to the highest level everything that came out, we would simply bankrupt the system. So one of the things that we have to think about, and I must say that I've thought of the question but not the answer, is how do we choose what we invest our limited resources in terms of curation and preservation for the long term.
If I could just respond, I just want to disagree. NIH does not have the notion that everything should be saved, and in fact, I give talks where the first slide is, we don't, saving and keeping all data doesn't make sense. So that's not our policy. And in fact, what I was talking this morning about using peer review to help us go through these things, it specifically is targeted to take the community norms into account. Yeah.
probably a follow-on to some of those, but in terms of the demand and actual usage of this data, maybe some of you could speak to some of the better examples of maybe its categories of use in terms of replication of a certain study or using the data for a new study. But I mean, what kind of outrage, or was there any reaction when the journal no longer started accepting or stopped accepting the supplemental materials? And I feel like a lot of these uses of the data probably can drive the prioritization of what needs to be captured. So are there stories like that yet?
I don't really think so. There was a big buzz when the journal stopped. But the truth is, I think most of their data are already being deposited in other repositories. And now it's just sort of a historical note.
So my question is kind of in between the idea of a business model and the kind of services that you provide. So, I mean, given the fact that there are cloud storage out there, you know, I'm just thinking about Amazon S3, this kind of already used in the academic community, kind of cloud storage with replication and all these kind of things. What would be the benefit of people coming to you instead of using these kind of services that are already out there and have well-established infrastructure and so on?
It might, given the fact that this idea was proposed and 60 libraries came together instantly and said we need to do this, with full knowledge of what Amazon's providing, there's probably a lot of hands in here that could talk to the specific needs. I don't know if we need to go down that tangent right now, but we're certainly not competing against somebody in the realm of Amazon 3. This is a community. The university community wants to own their own solution. They want to control how this works for the long term as part of their core mission of preserving the academic record. So it's not really just about who can provide the best bit level preservation at the best price. That's really not where we're working. And there are a couple of hands that probably answer better.
Yeah, this is Benno Blumenthal. I'm here at Columbia University and run a data library. But I think the precise issue is that the cloud is not about digital preservation. It's actually precisely the opposite of that. It's only interested in things at the moment. It's a computational service. They'll keep the data as long as you pay the money, and they throw it away immediately when you stop, which is not digital preservation in any sense.
This is Rob Cardellano, Columbia University Libraries. In fact, in the conversations we're having with DuraSpace, which is one of the agencies working with DPN, we are, in fact, looking at how some commercial service providers might integrate with a long-term digital repository. So, for example, maybe not Amazon S3, but Amazon Glacier, which is actually a service that is being offered by Amazon, could be a solution. The key thing, however, is you need to have a layer on top of that which provides some level of packaging and metadata. And the key aspect of DPN is that it doesn't rely on any one piece of technology and any one particular vendor in terms of how you store it. That's a very active research conversation. It's something that we're talking about with DeepIn right now. And the final note is when you use a commercial cloud provider, you have variable costs. In the case of Amazon, you have variable network costs. And one of the things that we strive for in universities is, at least in the library world, is some level of stability in terms of budgeting the costs of storage and preservation. And you have to factor in not just the storage costs, but the variable network costs. So those are just some of the things that are going on. It's not that cloud is not part of the solution. It may be part of the solution. It may be part of the solution for some communities and not other communities, and that all has to be factored into the conversation. What we're saying is that Amazon services are not precluded from it, as well as other commercial providers, but that there has to be a layer above that that provides for both an entrance strategy and an exit strategy for the contributing nodes for DPN and replicating nodes.
Hi, I'm Mark from Figshare, and I just wanted to say that we do exactly that. We have a layer on top of Amazon services, and we use S3 for the access for now, because if we're talking about access, but I agree if you're talking about archiving, then it's a completely different conversation. And we do use Glacier for our backups, but if you're talking about dark archives, then it's probably not cost effective. If you're talking about access now, then it is a good solution.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Any last questions? Any of the panelists like to make any comments?
What would motivate a researcher to set aside funding? That was about 20 minutes ago.
I'd like to add at the end, if I could, to come back to a comment that was made earlier by Gerhard, that there are models other than pay up front that can get money back into the repository. There are uses for data, commercial uses for data that are being done today, especially in the genomics area, as I was mentioning. And what they're doing is they're getting a free ride because they take the data that's freely available, they munge it around, they create products, and they sell those products. And they don't pay a license fee back to the repository that they got the data from. And that, to me, is a lost opportunity that could fund from the other end. It's maybe anathema to us, and I know I'm putting my head on the block here, being a commercial representative, but, I mean, even if we did that, why shouldn't we pay a license fee for the data that's in an academic research repository if we're going to turn it into commercial use? Because that can help, as another model, that can help fund some of the repositories.
Last question here. Comment.
So it seems to me this is all tied to the whole open access initiative. The carrot at the end of this stick that we find, I work at Harvard Business School, it's tenure. So if we're working with junior faculty who are working toward tenure, they will comply with anything you want them to comply with. If you're dealing with senior faculty who are out there consulting and there is no compulsion. I mean, no, they just don't need to comply with anything. So it seems to me, actually, I was having a discussion with Linda about EBSCO and the way they had this brilliant strategy to get a market in the K-12 schools, and they built this entire world of researchers who come to universities, and now all they want is EBSCO host, because that's what they were exposed to, and it's like Google. So if the carrot for the faculty who need to have tenure, working with getting an advisory board of university presidents to understand this issue, working with people at the highest level of the organization to promote this issue, and to begin to make it standard and requirement for tenure, just like we would really like to have open access be, it seems like that's where we need to start. The carrot is tenure for faculty.
All right, let's thank the panelists for a very stimulating discussion.